Okay, it is 1 minute past the hour of 11. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's event, which is to hear about and explore the findings and policy implications of our latest report, which we published last week. The report is called Town and Gown, the Role of Universities in City Economies. We have with us today my colleague, Rob Johnson. He's the lead author on the report. Rob, in a minute, is going to take us through the main findings from the report, use some slides to do that. So that'll take about 20-25 minutes. And then we'll have the remaining time up until 11:45 for queries or questions that you have about the report or implications arising from the report that we'll do our best to explore and answer. So if you've got anything, which we've already had one in, which is very good, if you've got questions that occur to you along the way, put them in the Q&A function, and we'll try to get through them as best as we can. So without further ado, and without saying anything more about the report, I'm going to pass to Rob, and Rob's going to take us through the big slides. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So thank you for joining. I'm going to take you through our latest report, Town and Gown, the Role of Universities in City Economies. Let me just share my screen again. Yep, there we go. So let's start off with a bit of context. So as you might know, universities are in a bit of a pickle. So that is a result of many different things, one of which are frozen domestic fees that have been effectively frozen for the past decade. At the same time, costs have been steadily rising, and universities face longer-term demographic challenges from decreasing numbers of young people and decreasing numbers of people going to university. So as a result of this, funding streams for these institutions have changed, and more and more of their funding are coming from international students. So it was about 5% 30 years ago, it's about 25% today. But that seems at risk in the current policy climate. We've seen increased restrictions on these students and further posited increased restrictions in things such as the skills white paper. We've seen talk about reducing the graduate visa time length, and most prominently a potential international student levy to come into effect. And so a combination of this kind of policy environment, and we've seen, let's say, some less than supportive rhetoric from certain MPs, and the sector is still awaiting the skills white paper. So there's a lot of uncertainty around at the moment. And the upshot is it means that a lot of these institutions are in financial trouble. So you see on the screen there the Office for Student projections that about 40% are in deficit this academic year, and there seems to be worries, if not expectations, that we might see some financial failures of these institutions, or at least a big scaling back of their activity. And we have to square this with the fact that government clearly recognises the importance of these institutions in the national economy. Now, I've just pulled out two examples here, but it's kind of emblematic of where that sits in the kind of national picture, one of which is Industrial Strategy White Paper. This is when talking about innovation. Universities are clearly name-checked there. And I think most notable is in the government's economic growth mission, literally in the first paragraph as a starting point for the environment the UK is in, world-class universities are name-checked. So this kind of sets up a tension, and one that we wanted to explore a bit in our report, and specifically about looking into their local roles. And this is key to understand, given that the way these institutions are distributed across our cities. So obviously, as part of the report, we define university towns as places where at least 10% of the population is made up by student places. You see your usual suspects there, Oxford, Cambridge, but also places like Coventry, Aberdeen, Brighton. And I think also important to highlight here. First, that these institutions are spread across the country, especially outside the Greater Southeast and in big cities across the country. And also that clearly having a university is no guarantee of economic prosperity. We see in the right-hand side of the chart, some of the most productive places in the country don't actually have a kind of a main registered university. Whereas on the left, we have places like Nottingham, Swansea, Sunderland, which are among the least, the least productive places in the country, but that do have some universities. So there's clearly something to tease out here, and that's exactly what we try and do in the report. Now we look at 4 economic roles they play in city economies. Now these aren't the only roles these institutions play, economic or otherwise, but we thought these are important and illustrative, and this is what I'll be taking you through today, some of our findings in relation to these roles. So let's get started with their role as high-skilled employers. So universities are big employers in their places. In Oxford, it's about 1 out of 6 jobs in the whole city. So that's bigger than their consulting, computing, and scientific sectors combined. And even in big cities like Liverpool, it's a significant proportion. I think in Liverpool, it's bigger than their finance and legal service sectors. And most of these jobs are high-skilled. Now, that's academic roles, but it's also lots of non-academic roles in management, sort of professional activities. And this is what I'm showing you with this chart here. Now, across the bottom, so here we're talking about knowledge jobs. Now, these are high-skilled, high-paying, office-based jobs that represent sort of the best opportunities for high-skilled workers in places. So across the horizontal there, this is the size of the private sector for these high-skilled opportunities in relation to all jobs in the city. And then on the vertical is the university contribution. And the kind of colored wedges you can see in the middle of this chart tell you the contribution of universities to these high-skilled, high-paying opportunities. So straight off the bat, you see what you might expect. Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, both have lots of private sector knowledge jobs, but also lots of contribution from universities. But I think what I want to draw out here is, places where you might not expect that to be the case, or at least places not as readily recognized for their universities. So I'll highlight some comparisons there. What this shows is that universities are more important in Dundee than Cambridge for local high-skilled opportunities. And it's the same for Hull versus Edinburgh. And you can kind of see at the bottom left there, other places like Stoke and Plymouth. The private sector, maybe doesn't have that many opportunities, so it makes the university's contribution, while smaller than, say, Oxford or Cambridge, it's as important, if not more important. And, this has implications for opportunities in these places, especially places with struggling economies that might not expect to have the private sector provide these opportunities. Now, the question there is obviously, are these roles additional to the local economy? Now, unfortunately, we didn't have the data to look at this in detail, but I think places like Dundee, Hull, Stoke, you'd expect, a lot of those roles not to be there if the university was not there too. Now, in places like Oxford, Cambridge, maybe York, Exeter, it's a bit more, there should be recognition that there might be kind of displacement, crowding out by these institutions. These are places that have maybe smaller than expected private sectors. They're fairly restricted in their housing supply, and the universities play a strong role. Now, the places, local authorities in these places should be alive to the fact that this could be a potential effect. But I think the overall point there is that, Oxford and Cambridge shouldn't have to trade off having a successful private sector with, world-class institutions. And that is clearly if you don't want this to be a trade-off, you need to allow these places to grow and allow the local labour markets to grow alongside. So moving swiftly on, we'll look at universities as international exporters. Now, that might seem a slightly strange framing, but these institutions do act like that. They provide services, in this case education, to people from abroad who bring in money into the economy, and then these international students go on to spend in the local economy. And so this has local economic impact. And what I've set out here is the contribution of universities in terms of economic output to their cities relative to all other international exporting activity. Straight off the bat, you can see that in Exeter, Dundee, Leicester, the top three, it's around 15% of this economic activity. So that is substantial, but also in big cities as well, they make up significant proportions. And I think the thing to highlight here is that 9 of the top 10 places where they're most important for this activity are outside the Greater South East. And actually the majority, if you look above Oxford in this chart, the majority of these are across the country rather than concentrated in the South East. And, when you look at it at a specific sector level, well, universities are the top international exporting sector in 4 of these cities, and actually most of the ones you see on the left-hand side, they're in the top 10. So, these have really important local contributions. I think this speaks to the point about national policy changes in the sector are going to have local implications. Now, that's not to say that government can't have maybe different ambitions for the university sector and what it does, what it provides, what economic roles it plays. But I think that requires an understanding of what has driven them to play this role in the first place. And that is in the context of universities have not always been such big international exporters, but it's because of the incentives that they face that they have kind of come to be in this position. So I think what illustrates this is if we compare former polytechnic universities, which mainly sort of traditionally dealt with vocational technical qualifications, and look at their share of overseas intake, as you might expect, that 30 years ago that was half of what the Russell Group was doing. This group of universities which kind of market themselves as globally competitive. But look to today, and that has changed. Given the funding constraints on universities, changes to the grant, freezing of domestic tuition fees, this has kind of pushed and kind of forced universities to fit into the same mold in some sense. And actually what we're seeing is at the postgraduate level, at least, where numbers have risen substantially over this period, former polytechnics actually have a higher share of overseas students than the Russell Group, which I think just goes to show that universities play this role because of the funding incentives they face. If government has different ambitions for this, then they must recognise that, and national policies such as the international student levy will have an impact on their role as international exporters and across universities. Now, the government might want to consider other, maybe I guess if that's a stick, then other carrots to incentivize them to change that role if that is what they wish. And we see things such as the lifelong learning entitlement, which would replace kind of tuition fees for a kind of a pool of money that each person can cash in at different points of their life, taking different courses, etc. That might be a step in that direction. But I think that's just important context for this role. Let's move on to the next role, which is universities as catalysts for city centre regeneration. Now, cities care about their high streets. It's often used as a kind of yardstick for local economic fortunes. And so I think it's important to recognise that universities in cities can kind of act as a lever to improve places' high streets. Now, what this chart shows is that cities have become bigger and younger over the past 20 years. And we can see that especially with the age demographic that is concentrated in university towns and big cities with strong university presence. And actually, we know from previous work at Centre Cities that I think around half of this so half the population increase in city centres has been driven by students themselves, particularly in sort of our big cities. And we see in terms of the age demographics, that effect is stronger in places with city centre campuses. So universities bring in students. Students need to live near where they study. So, how does that help high streets? Well, that has a role in centralising, economic activity in these places. You get more footfall in your high streets. We see that university towns have lower vacancy rates than comparable cities. So there's definitely a kind of, a local spending effect there. Now, let's not overstate that. Student spending power is limited. It's not the same as, say, attracting tourists or other visitors to your city. But, I think it's an important lever. But it's not just the students themselves, but it's kind of what investment and infrastructure they bring alongside them. So this is where I'm highlighting Coventry as a good example of this, where it's actually seen the highest growth in purpose-built student accommodation by private developers outside of London since 2019. So students want to live near where they study, and this can be a lever to attract in private investment into your city centre. And in Coventry is a good example because that they're undergoing a large city centre regeneration at the moment, and private, so student accommodation plays a big role in that, alongside direct investment from Coventry University, who's opening up a civic centre in the city centre. Now, again, understanding the limitations of that is important. Having a university, having lots of students does not guarantee these students stick around and become graduates in your local labour market, which is clearly important for your local prosperity. That requires, investment in opportunities in your city centre, in providing good jobs for these high-skilled graduates to go to, and clearly they need places to live. And so, that shows the limitation of private investment through student accommodation in these places. There has to be other provision on that front. So again, just kind of showing the limits of this lever, and this is why we frame universities as catalysts for city centre regeneration. That they're not the forefront of it, but they can be useful in places looking to improve their central high streets. Right, the final category is universities as innovators, and for this we took advantage of a new HESA dataset on university spinouts released this year, and that was the focus of what we looked at in this innovation category. Now, this section is slightly different because actually the local impacts are more limited than the other sections, and maybe you might think. So first off is to talk about the numbers. Numbers are relatively small. We think at best about university spinouts make about, at best, 2% of the innovative startups over the period we looked at. So numbers aren't necessarily the main driver here, and actually the spinouts that places generate, especially in university towns, are not guaranteed to stick around, which is what this rather complicated chart is showing you. So I can talk you through, explain a little bit how you interpret this. So if you look at Cambridge on the right-hand side, basically the green bars at the top tell you how many spinouts that city ends up with. The change that represents from the number that were produced there is this kind of light blue dot you see hovering there. And then we also show a kind of this net pull factor, which is how good is a place at attracting spinouts from other places, so based on the net change, but also how good are they retaining the ones produced locally. And what you see actually here is the 6 on the right-hand side are university towns where, some of them, especially Oxford and Cambridge, produce a lot of innovation. These cities are nurseries for this innovative activity, but actually a lot of these firms up and move to other places. And to emphasize here, this is not necessarily a bad thing. If we think about these cutting-edge firms, as the future of national economic growth, then we would want them to move to opportunities. And where should the best opportunities be for these firms? Well, it should be the big cities, which should be the center of this sort of the future economy, the cutting edge economy, firms that rely on knowledge and skills to function and produce economic output. And in London, in the case of London, that's exactly what we see. So I think the stat is 40% of university spin-outs that end up in London were actually incubated in other cities, and you see a lot of them coming from Oxford and Cambridge. But I think looking more broadly to the other big cities, are they performing their role in this way? Now, first off, we don't see that much activity in terms of spin-out generation, but if you look at the blue dots for these places, they all actually lose more spin-outs than they attract in each case. And this is probably not what we'd expect for big cities, at least not for big cities performing their roles as kind of centers of the innovative economy. So rather than a local angle necessarily for this role of universities, it kind of presents questions at a national picture. Are our big cities performing the roles they should? And this leads to a kind of wider question for industrial strategy. We need our big cities to be the places where these innovative startups, which in many cases will be at the cutting edge of their sectors, given their kind of birth in research-intensive institutions. Like, are we giving them the right places and the best opportunities to scale up and contribute to national economic growth? Right. So I've given you a whistle-stop tour of the four roles there. I've talked about specific implications under each one, but I think this kind of leads to more general lessons. So let's first look at what are lessons for national government. So I think the main thing here is that policy in the university sector, or even just inaction and kind of like status quo, just letting things carry on as they are, it might have implications for the government ambitions for growth in all parts of the country, for its economic mission, where they cite universities as an important driver of that. It's like you can have an immigration policy, and you can have levers to change that. You can have a growth ambition, but you know, with another part of your brain, so to speak, but you have to account for their interaction. And I think it's highlighting that while, say, further restrictions on international students might leave London or Cambridge relatively unscathed, you're directly impacting, you know, the top international exporter in Leicester, say, or particularly important high-skilled employer in Plymouth. So it's having this kind of place-based understanding of national policy implications. I think, yeah, the international student levy there is a sort of case in point. Now, the pledge is for any money raised from that levy is to be reinvested in the higher education and skills system. And to be honest, like, that's as much as we know about the government ambitions on that. But any government ambitions to, you know, change maybe what the higher education sector does or provides, you know, it must take these funding implications into account. Now, for local authorities and cities that have universities, it's that you can and should and can carry on doing so. You can see these institutions as having a prominent place in your local economic growth plans where they clearly play strong roles, but it's being more specific on that rather than just saying these institutions are great and they do everything and they're just, you know, they bring everything they can do into our economy. It's being clear on the roles that they play in different places, and also maybe the roles they don't play. And I think this is why the innovation stuff is important. It's, you know, you can champion your place as maybe a producer of innovation and kind of an ecosystem where that innovation can get off the ground, but, you know, maybe temper your expectations on what that can do to kind of the local innovative economy and the firms that end up there. And it's also the case of recognizing any trade-offs and limitations with the roles that they play. So, for instance, if your university is an important international exporter, how vulnerable is that? And how vulnerable is your exporting economy to, you know, national policy changes? You know, it's only one lever for local regeneration, and You'll have to do other things to keep graduates in your local labour markets. And in certain places, is there a chance that your higher education presence might be making your private sector smaller than it otherwise could be? So those are the main findings. There's plenty more detail in the report, and I think now for the remainder of the time, we'll take some questions.
Great, thanks very much, Rob. Tour through the findings. We've had a bunch of questions, not least most of them from Matthew McCartney. So some of your questions, I'm not going to reflect on all of them, Matthew, happy to talk outside. I think some of the questions that you raised were being answered, or at least partially answered, as Rob was going through the presentation. That's the first thing. The second thing is some of the points you're making we agree with, and in a sense that our broader work, which obviously is much broader than this particular piece, corroborates or at least highlights the issues that you are exploring or asking about as well. They're not in this report, but they are in the broader body of work that we've been doing for the last 20 years or so. So picked up on those kinds of things as well. And I think, you know, we've had a question which is an interesting one around is it better to have excellent universities in a small number of places or lots of mediocre universities throughout the country? Should universities in different parts of the country be performing different roles? I mean, there's lots to be said on that, and Rob will have have a view on that. You know, what is interesting, and one of the things that we're trying to highlight partially and imperfectly, as Rob said, is that actually, in some places, the roles that universities are playing are broadly similar. We've identified 4. All universities are playing a role, they're making contributions across those 4 places. Depending on the nature of the place that you are looking at, those contributions are either bigger or smaller, or more important or less important, depending on how you think about this. It's less about the variation on the role, it's more around the variation of its significance and importance. And my last point would be, and this is a supposition, so this is query, what will happen, we think, is if the university industry and sector continues to struggle, and we see places beginning to significantly reduce and or go out of existence, it's probably going to be in places that are more reliant on their universities and places that are less reliant on, ironically, Oxford, Cambridge and London will be fine. Their universities will thrive in any environment, all things being equal. But places like Stoke or places like Coventry may less so. And so there's questions about how we think about growth, how we think contribution, and how we think about local impact. And you have to think about all of those kinds of things, which many involved in this debate are very, very familiar with. But I don't know, what would you...
No, I definitely agree with all those points. And I think the distinction between, a few world-class institutions or maybe a kind of more, average set of institutions spread around the country is an interesting one. Now, clearly, world-class institutions are going to be few in number and be located in certain places, and they are clearly good at a national level for the national economy, but also good for their local economies. Now, what we're highlighting in this report is that certain institutions which, maybe in national policy terms seem like a drop in the ocean, and actually for kind of national policy ambitions, it might be less critical to achieving those things, or you might be, as a national policy maker, less concerned if that was to impact these places. These institutions are really important in certain places, and places that you do not often think of for their university. So, mention a few in the report here: Plymouth for kind of employment, and same with Hull, Sunderland. Now, you can change what you think the sector should be doing and sort of what roles it should be playing. But any changes you make have to be conscious of these roles, and just kind of any blanket national policy changes that might just immediately put a lot of these places at risk is cutting across any ambitions to drive growth in these struggling places, which, as we know, the government has highlighted again and again, is a priority. Now, I think possibly a message there is can the government look at the incentives that the sector faces? Can some of these institutions, maybe the institutions don't change, but the roles they play do change? That could be moving out of the kind of more fixed mold that universities have found themselves in recent years, and sort of expanding their offering in terms of different vocational qualifications, or maybe more sort of qualifications focus on local skill shortages and stuff like that, and which I think why the government proposal for lifelong learning entitlement seems to be an interesting move towards that. And I think that's partly the government recognizing that maybe even within kind of long-term demographic changes, everyone sort of goes to university at 18 and cashes in their tuition fee loan, is no longer a sustainable model in the long term. Can that transition to a kind of a budget that you can cash in at different points in your working career to sort of deal with specific skills you want to deliver? Maybe I'm interested to see how that develops, but I think it's understanding that the institutions are there to some extent. They play important roles in their local economies, and they can adapt, particularly if the focus becomes on contributing, say, skills to their local areas. You have them there, it's spread around the country, you can sort of leverage that. I think it's having these national policy changes with these sweeping impacts, and then, at least for now, without the skills white paper and kind of other uncertainty, not offering anything concrete in response, I think sort of leaves a risk to the sector and growth across the country.
Yeah, very good. A question from Lucinda. Lucinda, just to say, you asked a question. If you go onto our website and search out the Great British Brain Drain, I think that's what it's called, there was a bunch of university and movement related analysis we did, albeit it's a few years old, but it'll give you some insights into the nature of the questions about who goes to university, which universities they go to, whether they are from the locality that they live in, the locality where they go to study, and whether they stay and whether they leave. All of that is oldish data. It's 5, 6, maybe 7 years out of date, but you can get some insight into some of that analysis and some of those movements. Obviously, it would need to be updated to the present day, but it'll give you some insight.
I'd add to that probably at this stage it's the best or most up-to-date information you can get, given the issues, particularly around student locations with the latest census. So it's not ideal, but it's probably one of the best sources you can get on that.
Yeah, we got a question from John Goddard. Hello, John, a friend of the centre. Hope you're well. You emailed it, and you were the first in the Q&A. So his question is: should funding received by universities in our core cities from different parts of Whitehall be pooled under local growth deals to underpin civic engagement and minimise retrenchment, etc., etc.? I think it's a very good question, John. I mean, in part, it hints at some of the ambitions around integrated settlements, which you will know well. How do we pool different types of funding, particularly but not exclusively on the growth side of the issue? Can we, by pooling and removing some of those ring fences, can we make them more flexible? And as a result of making them more flexible, can we make them more efficient? I think there's an argument definitely in the integrated funding settlements to do that. As you well know, in government to date, some departments have been more willing participants in the integrated funding settlement than others. And so I think that in itself creates some constraints on how far we can go and how quickly. But I think your idea is certainly right. I mean, I suppose one of the additional things, and not to, and I know you don't think this, but part of the work that we've shown, I think, is that the way that universities get the vast bulk of their money is actually a big determinant of the role and the impact that they're having on localities. And whilst innovation type activity, entrepreneurial type activity, etc., is important and significant at the local, but particularly at the national level, when you're really trying to understand the impacts that they're having at the local level, it's through the ways that how big they are, as in how many people they employ, how many students they get, Where do those students come from? What's their footprint? Where is their footprint? Is their footprint expanding? Those are the kind of big local effects that you can see in those places, which is why then you start to see in some places that universities are having quite significant effects, even if they may be perceived as not being at the top end of the world-class rankings, whatever that might mean. Rob, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that, and I think there was an illustration of maybe that mismatch between expectation and reality now the former Innovation Secretary's speech to universities last week, where he was talking about a new pledge to the National Centre for Universities and Business to help drive commercialisation and innovation funding with a view to help universities. He recognised the struggles, and it was with a view to help them kind of diversify income streams. And that was couched in, the context of the importance they play, the local importance they have in their kind of home cities, home places. And it was an interesting framing, because I think from the research we've done as part of this report, it seems to be, this is clearly a good pledge, and, wanting to help universities be involved more deeply in local innovative ecosystems, and providing this capacity to the NCUB to sort of help them along their way on that is a good thing. But the effect will be limited and actually undermined if you don't recognise the more important local roles that these institutions play. And I think it was probably not the right framing to sort of talk about their importance in local places and then sort of say, and, to reassure you that we're thinking about your funding streams, we'll announce this funding. That is, their local innovation role is small. And actually, I think to give universities reassurance about funding streams, it's understanding these sort of bigger roles they play in light of the increased amount of funding that they get from, say, international fees, and the kind of incentives they face that have driven them that way. So I think that's an illustration of where, if you want universities to play this important role in innovation, maybe locally, but especially nationally, you've got to, first look at the local roles they play and understand kind of the incentives they face and the funding they get, and what is allowing them to sort of do these kind of activities that are important for national and local economic growth in the first place.
Yeah, very good point. And that touches on Chris Fletcher's question. So HE has been embedded in the LSIPs in England in a similar way that FEs were in the first lot of LSIPs. What drivers, carrots, etc., can be introduced to ensure that what is being provided is focused on skills needs rather than driving income? And I suppose that is the question and the issue really. Chris has been very clear about what it is that we want universities in general, but certainly in different localities. What is it that we want them to? What role do we want them to perform in the system, whatever that, however you define that, and to be making sure that the financial incentives and the instruments that you're providing to them are appropriate. So then, in a sense, they are then responding to the incentives based on what it is you're wanting to do. But again, just to reiterate what Rob said, and it's in the paper to a degree. For example, money is currently available to universities, particularly spread in some of our weaker economy places. The innovation, crudely, money available to them is dwarfed by the amount of money they get through fees, either from domestic or from international students. And if the access to either the domestic fee or the international student fee is reduced by a reasonable amount, which is some of the discussion that we're having, that will dwarf any financial benefits from participating in any innovation-related funding, which, all things equal, means those institutions will become smaller, and will do less. And if that's what we want, then we should be explicit about that. If that's not what we want, then we should equally be explicit about that and recognise that we need to do something. We need to have a bunch of incentives with finance associated with it, that they do the roles that we want them to do.
No, it's definitely an interesting question. I think one that we'll definitely be looking to with a keen eye toward the future, which is, our higher education system at the moment is tilted towards, I guess a more academic generalist kind of skills development. Whereas in the past, particularly in certain places with certain industries, it's had a kind of more local focus. Now, it's maybe swung sort of further one way than many people would have liked at the moment. Maybe there's potential to swing back, and then that certainly seems like what people are talking about in terms of, broadening increasing the flexibility of kind of tuition fee loan funding, and maybe encouraging certain institutions to offer different courses. Now, obviously, we don't know what the sectors of the future are going to be. What we do know is they're going to be focused in our big cities. And so there's a kind of separate question there of like, can you produce the skills across the country to allow the economy to perform in our big cities and the economy of the future, to drive future productivity growth? And, there's also an open question of, providing skill training for local skills gaps, can be well-intentioned. Will it have the local effect? Will graduates with higher skills simply move to other opportunities, which might be focused in other parts of the country? There's a lot of unknowns there, but I think it always goes back to, what are the incentives the industry is facing, and how can government tweak that while recognizing that any policy in the higher education sector, or indeed, their migration policy, will have impacts on their ambitions for growth across the country. The government can't have two brains when thinking about all these interrelated policy issues. It's got to sort of think in lockstep and understand that the higher education sector plays an important role in the local economic growth in places particularly outside the Great Southeast.
Indeed, two-brained government. Indeed, if it was only two, I think we might have a chance. Anyway, let's. So, Mevan, you've asked a question. You came back to it, and we have touched on it. So maybe we haven't been as clear as we could be. It's in the report as well, but maybe not as explicit as the way that you've posted your questions. So, can you elaborate on what you've done to consider if and how any economic benefits generated by universities and towns that might reach their community? So this is a sort of left behind question, Rob, which we weren't explicit, but part of the analysis is showing the significance of these places, often in places, towns and cities where their overall economy is relatively weak or weaker than it is in other places. So in some respects, their contribution is more important to actually provide economic opportunity, broadly defined, in absence of other opportunities. And this is why we don't have much tolerance for the sort of arguments. Well, if these universities weren't there, the private sector would miraculously grow and take up all of these opportunities and provide all of the jobs, etc., that these universities are currently. We're a bit sceptical, to say the least, about that kind of perspective or analysis. But just say a little bit more about how we think about the significance relative to the overall performance of different towns and different cities' economies.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, I think it was what I was trying to show with that first kind of like fan chart in the high skilled employer section, which is, measured by their contribution to kind of high skilled opportunities. Universities in Hull are as important as in Edinburgh. But if you think about the relative sizes of these contributions, in Hull, it's because, the university itself might be relatively small, but it's because their private sector offering of these kind of knowledge roles is small as well. And so, if you imagine a world without the university contribution there, that's going to have a lot bigger impact than, say, if you're in Edinburgh, right? You've got a big private sector there. You could expect some of that to pick up the slack, etc. So while I think it's highlighting the fact that in proportionate terms, these institutions are just as important in these places not readily recognized for their universities as the places you might expect. But you can expect those, given that, in some respects they're left behind places, you can expect that contribution to be even more important. And if they were not there, you would probably not expect the private sector to step in and sort of provide those missing roles for local high skilled workers, you probably expect those people to leave and find opportunities elsewhere, which I think, again, I hate to be a broken record about this, but again goes back to the fact that these institutions are more spread across the country than sort of normal economic activity, and then therefore given the strong local roles they play, that is important for delivering growth across the country.
That is a good point on which to finish, and not least because it's 11:45. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Rob for the presentation. You can get the report on our website, centreforcities.org. If you've got queries or questions on the report, please get in touch. If there's analysis or analysis that's not in there that you think we could do and it would be useful, then also get in touch. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks for being